the forbidden skeleton, the human bones that break evolution. In 1911, miners in Nevada pulled something out of the ground that scientists refused to talk about for over a century. Human bones. But not just any bones. These bones were wrong. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they completely destroyed everything we've been taught about human history. And when researchers tried to examine them, they vanished. Someone made sure these bones would never see the light of day again. What if I told you that the story of human evolution you learned in school is missing some pretty huge chapters? What if there were discoveries so disturbing that they had to be hidden away, locked in museum basements, or simply destroyed? Today, we're diving into the forbidden skeleton, the human remains that don't fit the timeline, the bones that powerful people don't want you to know about. Let's talk about what really happened in Nevada. And trust me, this is going to make you question everything. So here's the thing about science. We like to think it's pure. We like to think that scientists are these objective truth seekers who just follow the evidence wherever it leads. But that's not how it works. Science is run by people. And people have careers to protect, reputations to maintain, funding to secure. And when you find something that threatens the entire foundation of what we believe about human history, well, suddenly that evidence becomes very inconvenient. The Lovelock Cave discovery is one of the most suppressed archaeological finds in American history. In 1911, two miners named James Hart and David Pugh were looking for bat guano to sell as fertilizer. Bat guano was valuable back then because it's packed with nitrogen, which makes excellent fertilizer and even explosives. They ventured into this massive cave near Lovelock, Nevada, and what they found beneath layers and layers of guano was something that would challenge our entire understanding of who lived in North America and when. They found mummies, dozens of them. But these weren't like the mummies you see in museums. These were red-haired giants. We're talking about people who stood between 7 and 8 feet tall, with distinctly European features, living in North America thousands of years before any European was supposed to have set foot on this continent. The local Paiute tribe had legends about these people. They called them the Si-Te-Ka. According to their oral tradition, these red-haired giants were cannibalistic and aggressive. They would raid Paiute villages and eat the people they captured. Eventually, the Paiute tribes united and drove the Si-Te-Ka into Lovelock Cave. They filled the entrance with brush and set it on fire, trapping the giants inside. The Paiute elders said this happened a long, long time ago, generations before any white settlers arrived. Now, you might think this sounds like mythology. Just a scary story tribes told around the fire. But then those miners found the physical evidence. Skeletons, tools, weapons, duck decoys made with remarkable craftsmanship, and sandals that were 15 inches long. Think about that for a second, 15 inches. The average male shoe size today is about 10 to 11 inches. These sandals were made for people with truly massive feet. The miners hauled tons of artifacts out of that cave over the next few years. Unfortunately, because they were focused on the bat guano, they weren't exactly careful with the archaeological treasures they were destroying in the process. But word got out about the strange discoveries, and eventually, proper archaeologists got involved. In 1912, the University of California sent archaeologist Llewellyn Loud to investigate the site. He spent several years excavating Lovelock Cave, and he documented what he found in official reports. He confirmed the presence of unusually large human remains. He photographed artifacts. He noted the sophisticated culture these people had developed. The duck decoys alone were incredibly advanced, showing a deep understanding of waterfowl hunting that shouldn't have existed in North America at that time period, according to conventional history. But here's where it gets weird. After the initial reports, the narrative started to change. The giant skeletons were suddenly described as normal-sized. The red hair was explained away as a natural darkening process that happens to black hair over time when exposed to certain cave conditions. The European features were ignored completely, and most suspiciously, many of the actual bones disappeared. Some ended up at the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada. But when researchers tried to examine them decades later, they were told the bones had been misplaced or were too fragile to handle. Other remains allegedly went to various universities and the Smithsonian Institution. But tracking them down became impossible. It's like someone went through and systematically removed all the physical evidence that could prove these giants existed. Why would anyone do that? Well, think about what these bones represent. If there were 7 to 8 foot tall people with red hair and European features living in Nevada thousands of years ago, that completely destroys the accepted model of human migration and evolution. We're taught that humans evolved in Africa, spread to Asia and Europe, and then crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America roughly 13 to 15,000 years ago. These people were supposed to be the ancestors of modern Native Americans. But the Lovelock giants don't fit that story at all. They suggest that there was a completely different population in North America long before the accepted timeline. A population that either evolved separately or came from somewhere else entirely. And if that's true, then what else are we wrong about? Lovelock Cave isn't an isolated case, not even close. There are reports of giant skeletons being discovered all across North America, and these reports come from credible sources. We're talking about newspaper articles from the 1800s and early 1900s, when journalism actually required verification before publication. We're talking about Smithsonian reports, university excavations, and official county records. In 1883, the Smithsonian itself sent a team to investigate burial mounds in West Virginia. They found skeletons of people who stood over 7 feet tall. The official report described them in detail, noting their unusual size and robust bone structure. Similar discoveries were made in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Giant bones kept turning up, and they kept being officially documented. Then, something strange happened. After the early 1900s, these discoveries stopped being reported. Or, more accurately, they stopped being taken seriously. Any archaeologist who suggested that giant humans once inhabited North America was ridiculed and marginalized. The official position became that all these reports were either hoaxes, misidentifications of normal-sized bones, or sensationalized journalism. But here's the problem with that explanation. These weren't random people making wild claims. These were trained scientists, museum curators, and university professors. They knew how to identify human bones. They knew the difference between a 7-foot skeleton and a normal-sized one. And they documented their findings in official reports that still exist today, even if the actual bones have vanished. There's a pattern here that's hard to ignore. Whenever bones are discovered that don't fit the accepted narrative of human history, they disappear. They get locked away in museum storage facilities where researchers can't access them. They get declared too fragile to study, or they simply vanish without explanation, and the institutions that were supposed to be protecting them suddenly have no record of ever receiving them. The Smithsonian Institution is at the center of many of these controversies. There are dozens of documented cases where giant skeletons were sent to the Smithsonian for study and were never seen again. When researchers request to examine these specimens, they're told the bones don't exist in the collection or that there's no record of them ever being received. But the original shipment documents exist. The correspondence exists. The initial reports exist. Everything exists, except the actual bones. This isn't just about giants, by the way. Any skeletal remains that challenge the accepted timeline of human presence in the Americas tend to have a way of disappearing or being reinterpreted. There are skulls with features that don't match any known human population. There are bones that have been dated to time periods long before humans were supposed to be in certain locations. And there are anatomical anomalies that suggest there may have been much more diversity in ancient human populations than we currently acknowledge. Let's talk about the Star-Child skull for a moment. This is a human skull discovered in Mexico in the 1,930 seconds that has some truly bizarre characteristics. It has an abnormally large cranial capacity, unusual bone composition, and eye sockets that are positioned differently than normal human skulls. Some researchers have suggested it might represent an unknown human subspecies, or possibly even evidence of genetic manipulation in ancient times. Mainstream science dismisses it as a child with hydrocephalus, a condition that causes fluid buildup in the brain and can distort skull shape. But the researchers who've studied the skull extensively argue that the bone composition and structure don't match hydrocephalus cases. They've done DNA testing that shows it is human, but with some genetic markers that don't fit any known population. Whether the Star-Child skull represents something truly anomalous or is just an unusual medical case, what's significant is how the scientific establishment handles it. Rather than thoroughly investigating it with an open mind, it gets immediately dismissed and ridiculed. Anyone who suggests it might be something worth studying seriously gets labeled a pseudoscientist. The skull exists, people can examine it, but there's no institutional support for proper research because the implications are too uncomfortable. But what if that timeline is wrong? What if it's not just slightly wrong, but fundamentally incomplete? There's mounting evidence that human civilization is much older than we've been told. There are structures around the world that mainstream archaeology cannot explain. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is a massive stone temple complex that dates back nearly 12,000 years. That's 6,000 years before Stonehenge and before humans were supposed to have the organizational capacity to build something so sophisticated. There are perfectly cut stone blocks at sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia that show machining precision that shouldn't have been possible with primitive tools. There are ancient maps, like the Piri Reis map, that show Antarctica without ice, suggesting either the map was based on much older source maps from when Antarctica wasn't frozen, or that ancient people had knowledge and technology we don't credit them with. And then there are the bones, the skeletons that don't fit, the remains of people who were too tall, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong physical features. These bones get hidden away because they threaten a narrative that powerful institutions have spent over a century building. Why does this matter? Because if we're getting human history wrong, if we're deliberately suppressing evidence that contradicts the accepted story, then what else are we wrong about? How much of what we think we know is actually true? And how much is just the version of history that someone decided we should believe? The Lovelock giants weren't primitive cavemen. They had sophisticated tools and technology. They made duck decoys with such craftsmanship that modern hunters would be impressed. They had developed a culture and a way of life. And they were here in North America long before anyone was supposed to be here according to mainstream history. The fact that their bones have disappeared is not an accident. The fact that you probably never heard about this discovery in school is not an accident. There are gatekeepers in archaeology and anthropology who control what gets published, what gets funded, and what gets taught. And those gatekeepers have a vested interest in maintaining the current narrative because their entire careers are built on it. Think about how academic science works. You need funding to do research. You need to publish papers to advance your career. You need approval from your peers to get those papers published. If you challenge the fundamental assumptions of your field, you don't get funding. You don't get published. You get labeled a pseudoscientist and pushed out of academia. So even scientists who find evidence that contradicts the mainstream narrative have a powerful incentive to either ignore it, explain it away, or keep quiet about it. This creates a system where paradigm-shifting discoveries get suppressed, not through some grand conspiracy, but through the natural institutional pressure to conform. Scientists are human. They have mortgages to pay and families to feed. They're not going to risk their careers by promoting controversial findings, even if those findings are legitimate. But every now and then, evidence emerges that's too significant to completely bury. The Lovelock Cave discoveries are documented in official reports. The newspaper articles from the 1800s and early 1900s about giant skeletons are archived and available for anyone to read. The Paiute legends about the Sita Ka have been passed down through generations and recorded by anthropologists. The evidence is out there if you know where to look. What makes the Lovelock giants particularly compelling is the combination of physical evidence, native legends, and official documentation. This isn't just a wild story someone made up. This is a discovery that was excavated by professionals, documented in official reports, verified by multiple sources, and supported by indigenous oral traditions. And yet, it's been almost complete.